I'm very excited to kick off this, not only this particular panel, but the entire track. This is how the Regenerative Food Systems track will be kicking off at SOCAP, and we have a stellar team right here. I wanted to introduce Heiner Bowman, who's the Executive Director of the Climate Action for Smallholders, the CASH Coalition, big fan, and that they specifically focus on making regenerative agriculture profitable for smallholder farmers. Heiner's background is in social entrepreneurship, and then he actually built a social entrepreneurship from scratch that supported millions of smallholder farmers. And then also he did a lot of coalition work around smallholder farming, and he'll talk a lot about that. He's also the co-founder and former managing director and board advisor of Precision Development, which provides digital services to over 9 million smallholder farmers. There's a lot of his work that specifically relates back to both regenerative agriculture and the idea of making climate action profitable. And I just want to hold space for the fact that we're not just talking about regenerative agricultural practices in this panel, but specifically how it involves funding and investments, and like specifically in that lens, and not just like the gardening of it. So I also want to introduce Bernard Kawash, who leads the UN World Food Program, the Innovation Accelerator, which he founded in 2015. It's a number of things that he's started that I can't wait to like delve further into. He's had many years of experience in innovation in tech and global companies, UN organizations, startups. He's made the Accelerator the world's largest social impact startup accelerator, and in 2023, its portfolio impacted 61 million people, doubling growth annually and raising $295 million for innovations. He also created the Share the Meal app, and that's going to be something I'm particularly interested in, the use of AI and technology for this space. And he raised over $130 million and was named the best app of 2020 by Apple and Google. Very exciting. And then last but definitely not least, Ada Asakwa, who is joining us from Lagos. Round of applause on that. Thank you. He's a Nigeria-based entrepreneur and investor with over 20 years of experience. Ada does so much. I think she has like 3 separate bios for like all the separate things that she's doing. She's worked in investment banking. She's worked in development finance. She's done private equity, public service, and now she's an entrepreneur. She serves on the board of One Acre Fund, also personal fave, Delta 40, and others. And she was named Forbes Africa Businesswoman of the Year 2021 and in a Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum. Welcome. I just wanted to introduce myself. I am the Chief Innovation Officer of the Solutions Journalism Network. I specifically run an initiative called the Insights Lab that uses our approach of response and evidence-based storytelling to actually apply it to the social sector. So one of the things that you will constantly hear me push this panel about is like, what are we actually doing that is working? We are, I think, all on the same page about all the stuff that isn't working. So I want to know what has people been doing that is working. So I'm going to open it up with that question specifically for all of you. What are you seeing in the regenerative food agriculture space, specifically around investing, that has been working? Anada, I can start with you.
Yeah, sure. No, thanks, Ambika, and thanks to everyone for being here. I think I can come at this with maybe three lenses. The first is, as an investor myself, as a financier, I have designed a number of financing structures and instruments that typically focuses on unlocking capital to the underserved spaces. So everything from, agri-SME funds or stuff to do with youth SMEs or for women-focused agri-food businesses. I'm just really passionate about ensuring that we unlock capital to these underserved spaces. So for me, as I think about the fact that you hear the huge numbers of 200 to 500, million dollars or $1 billion, I believe, that is required to transition us from just the usual conventional agriculture to regen agriculture. Those are huge numbers, and that's required every year for the next 10 years, according to estimates. It's like we need to find that money somewhere. And so how do we think about the structures to do that? The blended finance instruments, bringing all the right partners around the table. It is possible. Today, someone said it at the panel that they got excited about impact because they heard about the hundreds of trillions of dollars that were out there in AUM, but where was it going? So I feel that's the first thing for me, and I feel that there are indeed solutions, and we can talk about that in a bit. The second lens I kind of come at this topic with is as a board member of some really influential organizations that are doing some incredible work in climate resilience and regen ag. Organizations like AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution, being at the policy level and being able to influence government. We go for our board meetings and we actually go on the farm to see demonstration plots of farmers who are using regen and seeing the yields that are coming out of that smallholder farmers. Or 1 Acre Fund, what they're doing with agroforestry and being able to be in a position. I see the chair of our board here, I'm his vice chair, and we know how we work with the team and really push them to do more, from seeing the first seedlings of the trees they were giving for free to smallholder farmers. And now seeing the millions of, 74 million trees have been planted. And then you think back to the money that supposedly has been committed to agriculture coming out of COP. We're all at COP, many of us were there, COP28 in Dubai, and 7.7 billion or so was committed to this space for climate action plans by 150 countries. 2.2 billion is supposed to go to regen ag. But then we find that the data is showing that only 17% is going to upstream production-based, the farmers, financing, climate financing to them. And then you have only 1.7% going to smallholder farmers. That's an injustice. And
where's the rest of the money going?
To the bigger companies, the big food companies who have the leverage. So for me, there's just something on the governance level that we all have a role to play. And the third thing is just really simply, as an African woman living it day in, day out, 50 million smallholder farmers who are climate vulnerable on the continent. It just, I am a food entrepreneur. We buy from farmers, and I know how the prices of our products just go up and down, because if it's not the Malawi cyclone, if it's not flood somewhere else, it's a drought and there hasn't been rainfall, and it just goes throughout the entire system. So I have a personal passion to make a difference in this, and my company specifically, in how we find the solutions. We utilize indigenous crops, so the fonio, millet, sorghum, cassava, what our farmers have been told not to farm anymore. Instead, do the big maize, the staple crops. Let's do mechanization. Let's use improved seeds, and now they're so exposed because we're not intercropping or we're not diversifying our crops. So let's go back to how African farmers had been farming for so long. And I believe it's by doing it with our company Newly and buying from them and being very intentional about ensuring we're bringing back these forgotten crops, these indigenous crops. We're making a difference in that way to tackle this issue. Thanks.
That makes a lot of sense. Bernard, how do you see the impact investing space in regenerative agriculture?
So obviously everything that you said is like spot on. So like this is I have to say, like, this is where, coming from, like, also as World Food Program, like what we care about is like, okay, how can we end hunger? Now at the same time, how can we end hunger and not destroy the planet, which is like what brings us to regenerative food systems, right? And I think this is something that specifically, as you're asking about like the investment sphere or like what's there, I think there's a lot of things about like, it could be business model innovations, but also technology that can enable things. So like not just because it's doing the right things, but it also helps people, like people that are otherwise like from, low income marginalized community groups, for instance, and all of a sudden they have a future, and there's a company that even is investable and has, can actually do great while doing also good things on the world. And going from this, I mean, this is just a generalization, but going from that into like just to look into how can technology help, and like how can it particularly help, smallholder farmers, people who are coming from like, rural areas, remote groups, like maybe just to say, let me point out 2 or maybe 3 startups that we've been working with. One called Nihilus, and like I'm excited about that. Argentinian startup. They connect essentially the last mile from like either cosmetically rejected foods, soon to expire foods, to urban food deserts. They've been active in Mexico and Argentina. We've helped them expand in Peru and Colombia. With a specific case, and like this is something that's really sad because it's, why do you say like, what's the problem there? Well, in urban areas, people cannot afford healthy diets because, the supply chain is broken. At the same time, there's food that goes to waste. And then, they also work with single moms that store crates at their homes that they become the community retailers, if you want, at the same time. So they're tackling a couple of topics at the same time through technology. Like, is a technology startup essentially that's investable. The other startup, and I already heard like Ignitia. I'm excited about them. Like their social business essentially use satellite imagery AI, and they've developed essentially weather models for rural parts of Africa. So things that have been, if you want, neglected by like the original profit-making, well, let's focus on the US systems only, but you can actually do this. And right now they have about 2.7 million, they've had 2.7 million paying smallholder farmers, recurring about 700,000 paying smallholder farmers in multiple countries in Africa. And what's exciting is that it's not just, you might think about, well, people running around with a smartphone. No. A lot of the farmers, they'll have a feature phone, and then they'll get SMS texts, so like plant seeds now, like harvest now, storm is coming, so essentially storm warning, talking about like how can you adapt to climate hazards and risks. And I think this is something where technology can, specifically talking about the investment space, that's really exciting, where all of a sudden like the technology makes it not only affordable for people, like even if you're currently in a lower income space, but at the same time, you can actually make this, global reach even and possible. And I think this is something that excites me, where as we're coming together here as well as like, some of the, investors, organizations, UN organizations, like, okay, how can we do more together and like enable also like these startups, technologies to really go to scale?
That's great. Einar?
Super. Thank you. So it's great to see many friends sitting here in the audience as well. So you asked what is working, right? And I think for me, what's working in the first place is, so I'm part of a network that has 13 organizations that all work with smallholder farmers. And when I see the work that they're doing right now, I feel stuff is really happening. It's not happening at the level we would like to see it happen, but the work that they're putting in deploying those assets that are coming in, and at this moment it's mostly a combination of debt and philanthropic money. And I think that philanthropic money is absolutely critical and essential. There's also some small equity opportunities, but that's kind of less what I see right now, because they don't want to, they're not set up for this. They're not able to, absorb it as equity. And so that's one thing that gives me hope and that I see is working. What I see as well is that there's some players that have picked up some of the regen practices and really focused on that. If you think about agroforestry, for example, and Acorn Rabobank and what they're doing in terms of, finding and deploying money, right, specifically for regen, that regen practice in agroforestry and going into tying it up to the carbon markets and moving now from above ground to soil carbon, etc. These are all exciting things that are happening, right? I know I see other things that are working. I see Roy sitting here with TIFS, who's an intermediary who is trying to help to connect the practitioners, the people who deliver, things on the ground, to people who have the money. But honestly, it is not, we are so far from, what is needed right now, right? In terms of having that money. But it is not just money that's missing. There's also, often I feel the understanding is not really there. And I'm taking this from the point of view of the smallholder farmers, what they're going through, kind of, let's just take the example of carbon, right, and having markets for this, right now. So if you look at carbon markets and agroforestry, you know, on average, we modeled it out for different of the initiatives. It's somewhere between, you know, 10, 12, 15% of their total household income would be carbon-based, right? But this requires them to transition into agroforestry and doing all sort of stuff. And so that is one portion of their income. And then they would have to wait many years for this to materialize, right? And upfront payment, they don't have time. They don't have 5 to 7 years to wait until these payments are coming, right? And so who is there to bridge that time, you know, in a proper way and make it work? And then on top of this, does the farmer have the access to that land later on? Does he or she have the rights to the land and being able to benefit from the investments that they're putting in place, right? So these are real on the ground issues. And so we are looking for investors, partners, right, who understand the perspective, what it means on the ground for the people who are the land stewards that we want to work with.
So yeah, I want to go back to like who is responsible for funding that specifically. I would love for you to hear about green bonds. And I was at the Clinton Global Initiative a few weeks ago, and there's this real feeling of like climate is a health issue, health is a gender issue, gender is a, you know, there's that trifecta of happening. So I'm also curious from your perspective, and for those trying to invest in this space, how is it the health folks that need to do the investing, or how do you see that this space, and specifically around bonds and loans? And Bernard, I'm going to start with you.
It is very interesting, and like I think everybody here probably knows this, but like, you know, food systems like farm to fork represent about like a third of human-made greenhouse gases. So like, you know, it's like if you think about like, you know, food systems, like why does it matter? Like, well, should we talk about a third of human-made greenhouse gases? I guess we should. Now, of course, that also involves like, you know, transport, production, like food waste. Like there's a lot to you know, dissect if you talk about that. Now, it is something when I concurring with what Heiner just said, like about like yes, philanthropic capital, grants, all of that is like that's. Of course, like the more the merrier. Like I think this really can make a step change. I think it's also where you're investing into sustainable solutions, like, you know, startups, innovations, things that can make a lasting change. You can have a multiply on that. In addition to like, you know, just there also needs to be, you know, I don't know, either through policy changes or investments, like it's sometimes harder. Like it's easier to see a return on a startup that works with like hundreds of thousands of smaller farmers than working with each individual farmer, right? Now going to loans and like the investments there. So it's actually, as a World Food Programme historically, like for the last 60 years, we've only worked grant-based. I mean, we've worked with partners, international financial institutions, but actually for the first time now, we started a loan and guarantee fund with UNCDF. It's a UN Capital Development Fund. And it's fascinating for me, like, because I think this is one of the spaces where if we want to see more impact, we need more capital, and not just the grants, not just the philanthropy, but we also need more private capital. I'll say patient capital, because like you don't want to have 25, 30% interest rates, because like who is willing or able to repay those types of loans, right? And I think this is where I believe there is a big market for people who might be willing to take the risk. Not what just like, and maybe not the market risk what's adapt. And I mean, I'm sure you'll confirm that as well. Whereas like, it's a 30% market rate. Like none of the startups should be taking those loans. Maybe not none, but like it is really not a good business model if you have to shoulder those interest rates. So meaning, I think patient capital, like investors or high net worth individuals, foundations, like, but people who are also like willing to actually like not just give away money, but actually invest. I think there's a huge opportunity there, specifically in like, we have a program we call She Can, where we give microloans to World Food Programme, the people we serve, like specifically women who otherwise are, you know, cut off from microfinance. They never, because they have no collateral, right? Right now, this is still small, like 10,000 people, 10,000 women, and like, you know, with 99.9% repayment rates on those things. It's like, if I'm telling you this, it's like, so the money that we gave out as loans came back. and we're going to give it out again as loans, right? And you just have to think about this. Like when also talking to traditional funders is like, that sounds like a very smart thing to do.
Can I just ask if somebody was coming to you and saying, what should I invest in? Would it be smallholder farmers, like female smallholder farmers in the Global South? Is that what you would say?
Well, I think it depends on like what your logic is and what your risk appetite is, I would say. Like I think this is where I mean, I started my career working in management consulting, so like I have a kind of return on investment logic. I want to do things that have the biggest bang for the buck, right? So and this is when you look into that, it's like, okay, like what you want to do is like you want to tackle like nutrition for essentially mother and child nutrition. You want to have like, you know, like essentially that's one of the lenses you have. The other thing is like, where do you think your money can make a difference? And then like this is where specifically working, if you have a risk appetite, you know, working with scale-ups, startups, some systemic changes that will have a multiplier, I think that's what I would argue for. But not to say that that's like, if somebody says like, hey, I want to invest into like making a chicken farm more productive, I mean, by all means do that, right? It's just where I'm saying like in terms of, I'm a fan of like kind of this, the same thing if people do like venture investing here, like you probably want to invest into breakthroughs that could give you a payback. And I mean, that's when you then go into like, okay, finding the great founders, finding the great people that actually started all those companies. And, you know, if they've been successful, that means they might be successful again in the future. And like there's great things that use AI and other things in the space as well.
Yeah, so I want to jump in. So I find it fascinating and saying, you know, like the biggest return for the buck, right? The question is optimizing for what? And we have these people coming in saying, this is what I want to do. And it's usually one thing or two things that they want to optimize for. I want to optimize for the maximum of carbon that you get, right? But for a farmer, the carbon is just one aspect, right? We're talking, as you mentioned before, we're talking here about livelihoods aspects for that farmer. We're talking about ecosystem, you know, services that need to be supported. We're talking about cultural aspects, right, that have a value. So what I'm missing is the people who come in and say, okay, walk me through the values that you're creating, right? What are those co-benefits? And then having the willingness to say, I'm willing to pay for those co-benefits, right? And I often am involved in seeing these conversations where ultimately getting back, I need to get my one dimension right? How can you help me to do this one thing? It doesn't feel like a partnership to see of how we can make that progress together. It feels like how can we, or we're pushed into satisfying a certain investment scheme and a certain return on investment, right? That is optimizing for a single or maybe two aspects rather than for what, you know, we see a smallholder setting needs and requires at this moment to be a good partner in this endeavor.
And that's why it's so important to pretty much design financing instruments that meet the needs of the different players out there, right? And for me, that's sort of how I think about it, and I dice this. You know, we just finished designing something for young entrepreneurs in Nigeria, and it's got 3 sleeves. It's got a private equity sleeve. So if you're a VC investor, if you want the high returns, if you're an LP that wants to do that, hey, that's for you. It's got a sleeve for risk sharing. So it's a credit guarantee scheme. So let's do that. Let's back and support first loss for the bank so that they can lend more and you can bring out funding to the sector that you want. And then finally, it's got an ecosystem development fund where you have the grants, right? I didn't call it TA. I just didn't want that word, technical assistance, because it's so much more than that. And that's sort of played out. So it's about how do you truly effect change for the system, right? So it's policies, because we have to get into that. We have to get into policy. Because you're spending, globally, I believe it's nearly $1 trillion is being spent on subsidies to the agriculture sector. And that's conventional agriculture. That's your monocropping, that's your maize, that's all of that. So how do you start telling those folks who are trying to optimize for yield so that they can get into the next cycle of getting nice money from the government? How do you tell them that they should start doing regen ag, right? So policy, you have to have a seat on the table, and we have to have that conversation. But it also does supporting the early stage folks. So there could be a young entrepreneur, part of your accelerator, who is doing some really interesting things in regen, or really interesting microbiomes to support the soil health, and they just can't find the funding, or VCs just don't understand it, or it's too risky. So why don't I put grant capital, catalytic capital of $50,000, $100,000 to get that going? And once they get up and running, they move on to do more. So in all those different areas, those different sleeves, there's a type of investor for that. So there's a philanthropic capital that might want to come into that ecosystem development fund. It resonates with them. The folks who do the risk sharing and also or whatnot. So for me, I think that usually works. It's sometimes these things shouldn't be too complicated, right? Just design something that you see work and tailor it to the situation. But we truly need to take a step back and see what are those binding constraints to unlocking capital to the space, and start sort of peeling it back and tackling those issues one by one.
So we definitely have work to do on the policy side. I think a big part of that is also the standards that are set up right now in the voluntary carbon markets, for example, are not set up to help really the frontline workers, especially the smallholder farmers, right, or the forest populations. They are not set up to help them, succeed in that environment. So we do have a lot of work to do. What's also important to see is that working with smallholders, and you started with that, is it the individual, farmer, the typical capital provider doesn't have access to the one simple farm, right? So you need someone who is in the middle, like an aggregator, right? And it's clear that if you work with, let's say you want to have a project with 1,000 hectares, it is much easier, and today the system is much easier for a group that goes to one place and has a lot of 1,000 hectares, right? Works with one entity, right? And that's what we're set up for right now. We're not set up for a system where you work with 1,000 people who have each 1 hectare, right, to do that work. And so there's aggregation work that needs to happen, and someone needs to pay for that aggregation, right? And so it's an additional cost, but what I'm saying you're getting is you're getting resilience if you're investing into this. And why are you getting the resilience? One is because it's not all in one location. So if you had a fire, it's not in one location. The second thing is, if you have 1,000 farmers who do it, you don't have a monocropping situation, right? And monocrops, they are just there for nature to being attacked, right? Because that's how it goes, and it's not resilient. Monocultures are not resilient, right? And so if you distribute it and you work with 1,000 folks, you build in resiliency. And what I would like to see are those investors who see that there's the value in this, and who are the pioneers who say, hey, I want to go in, go all in and start and focus on this, because longer term, I'm going to see the benefit and the return from investing in folks who are more resilient. So people are right now putting money into agriculture. They protect their investment by going into putting organic matter into the soil and preparing for that next drought or for that next, flood with another.
To be honest, at the end of the day, we still have to get the big folks along, the off-takers from those farmers you just described, and that really presents more of a bankable sort of opportunity for an investor or someone who's funding. And it's unfortunate that right now, even with the many, at least about 80 or so big food companies that we know of that have made big commitments to regen ag, I believe less than 10% or so have actually put it into their budget. So it's nice, it's sexy to talk about it because everyone's talking about it, but how do we start holding feet to the fire to make sure, because it obviously would improve the bankability for the smallholder farmers. We have to be so intentional about it.
So there's two things that I think are very hard for people to make reason of. One is that we want everything to scale, but we know that regenerative agriculture and all farming is hyper-local. So we're constantly into localization and hyper-local solutions, but people want to invest in scale. And how do we make sense of that, and where is that? And then the smallholder farmers who we would like to invest in, that we are like, this is where the money should go, are also the folks who have probably the biggest land rights issues, the hardest issues around soil degradation, the most vulnerable to climate. So they're in some ways the riskiest entities to invest in. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about trying to make sense of that. And just a heads up that Garrett's coming around to give index cards for anybody who wants to write questions, and I can field some for the Q&A. I think this year we're writing them in very formally, so we'll be doing that. But yeah, Bernard, I thought we could start with you with those contradictions.
Scale versus localization. Again, this is I think something we're
sorry, scale versus localization, and most vulnerable and most investable.
Well, it's tough. Like, so let's say, I think the question is like, what's the scaling pathway? Scaling pathway could be organizations, could be like working through partnerships with local partners, could be like replicability through open source. Like, so there's a ton of different things. And by the way, if anybody has the one solution, do tell me. But like, I think, so we are using a lot of these different things, including like, so for instance, we have what's called Farm to Market Alliance, which is a public-private partnerships of some of the large ag companies, local companies, World Food Program, AGRA, where we do exactly that. Like, so how do you actually scale? In that case, with 700,000 smaller farmers. Now, in that case, if you have a startup, we can say, hey, let's test this in the alliance, and they operate with Farmer Service Center, and all of a sudden, you can start testing with 700,000 smaller farmers, which is, of course, a lot different than trying to go to 100 farmers and here 100 farmers there. But ideal solution is like, look at problems as an investable thing, and like the same way, like if you think about all the smaller farmers, like the opportunity and potential that they're not actually getting the best out of the soil, that's a huge opportunity, right? So I think it's not easy, so it's a tough challenge, but like it is very investable, I think.
Yeah, so I don't think you can scale without working with the smallholders, right? Because we're talking about 500 million households, and so if someone says, "Oh, I'm scaling it up, right, and I'm going to get to whatever." 10,000 hectares, 100,000 hectares, that's tiny, right? So what we need and what we'd like to see is hundreds of millions being part of this, right? Hundreds of millions of hectares, right, of land that are going to get this benefit, and that's what we need. So scale, we need the two things. And I don't think they're opposite. I don't think that meaning, scale means you can't work with smallholders. I think customization is possible, and technology companies have shown that actually, radical customization is going to allow for scale, right? And so what you need to do, though, is you need to bring in technology, right, to simplify and to reduce the costs that typically it takes to work with so many people. And that's where we're looking for partnerships with technology firms, right, who can help in that process. And this is technology all around, not just the fintech world.
Ada, you had anything to add to that? And then specifically about helping smallholder farmers in terms of things around like land rights and how do we get the folks who really are having the toughest time with climate also to be able to invest in regenerative agriculture?
I mean, it's like I think just to say there is business opportunities, there's technology opportunities that now make this a lot easier right now than it was 2 years, 5 years ago. Even right now, I mean, we are working with smaller farmers where they have access to weather insurance, parametric insurance, forward-looking, so essentially before disaster strikes. I mean, these are the types of things, years ago without AI, without satellites wouldn't have been possible. And I think this is where we need to be looking for these types of things so that becomes investable, that they are actually also part of making them resilient, like in climate adaptation for the future.
We need to capture the data. It all starts with that in many ways. So I hope people come to the session that you're hosting which would speak to that issue. But you know, that's one of the big things for me too.
There's actually a delegate-led session together with Alex, who's sitting in the back here. So like that we'll co-host tomorrow. So small plug.
Do you have concrete, sorry, I'm now reading some questions. And I think I'm just going to take one answer for each question just because we have a lot. Do you have concrete examples of philanthropic money enabling impact investing in the smallholder space at scale?
I was just like, absolutely, 1 Acre Fund is just one big example. Just millions of farmers and they're a machine when it comes to raising philanthropic money, and because they have shown the SROIs work, you know, they've shown that return on investment, they've shown the returns to the smallholder farmers and the impact on their lives. They have been very intentional about listening to the farmer and listening to the voice of the farmer. And for me, that's one of the things that resonates with me when I sitting on that board. It's about a farmer saying, okay, it's not just about the maize I've been growing. I see my neighbor farmer or my friend says coffee is quite interesting, and it's about giving them the coffee beans and going on to do coffee, and they start seeing their yields increasing in that space, and they in a higher value crop, and their wealth increases. So absolutely, that's just one example that comes top of mind, and I see a few 1 Acre Fund veterans here in the audience, so thank you for the work that you do.
Speaking of the 1 trillion in subsidies, can large farms do regenerative agriculture?
I mean, like, let's say I've seen regen ag, like large-scale farms, like arguably, like it's a lot easier to do certain changes in large-scale farms than with some smallholder farmers. However, and this is where, again, as World Food Programme, out of the 757 million hungry people on the planet, 500, 600 million are smallholder farmers, which means, like, yes, we do need to talk about smallholder farmers, how they can be regenerative. And like, I think just in large-scale farms, like this is where the question is a lot more like a lot of the technology, like when it goes to precision use of pesticides, precision use of like where do you actually need water, like so there's lots of things you can do with technology like that are a lot easier to afford if you're large.
Do you see similar challenges and opportunities across crops and livestock? I like that question. We didn't talk about the animals.
Also, I mean, like, let's say livestock farming is not very popular in the climate sphere. Like, at least, although I have to say, like, this is where, if you think about this, everybody who actually still eats meat or chicken or anything else, like, so there is, you know, app solutions, data solutions, AI solutions that will make these things like better using, like, you know, actually more efficient growing if you want, better for the animals. So like there is opportunities also in livestock. Now, notwithstanding that, you know, it starts with diet and what people consume and like standards and lots of other things.
What were you gonna say, Ada? With less than 50 harvests, less than a 1.4 billion deficit, I think it's deficit market in food in the US alone, how is tech the solution and not the problem and the reason we're in this mess? Tech. Everyone's looking at you.
You're the techie.
I mean, I like, okay, so let's say, I think one thing is like, so are farmers like intentionally destroying the planet? No, I would argue farmers intentionally have an interest in taking, you know, taking care of the land, taking care of the future of nature. Like, so I think there's like, I think the question is implying if people are, you know, are they intentionally like, you know, destroying the planet? I don't think so. So I think there's an element of like, okay, can technology help? Can investments help? Can more knowledge help? And I think this is like where a lot of people would be interested, like if they get a fair remuneration or income on what they're doing, if they actually, you know, like they have a future, if it's actually something that they see themselves. Sometimes it's also about like, and this is what happens with smaller farmers, like kind of like the model farm or something like that. I think the same thing, like the US will have the same issues where, you know, you'll need to prove that it's actually possible. And then once you see your neighbor making more money than you, like you will maybe adopt this.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and say that the tech side, MRV, is really a space where we can make huge progress through the technology. And tying it back to what we discussed before on the land rights, right? The issue is often on titles, it's not there. And more we see customary land rights is what matters. So if you can prove that certain communities have been working in these forests in this and this way, you can prove that these communities were already doing this work, and then you have the right in many countries to actually to get titles and to get certain rights, right? And that is possible through technology. If you go back and you do satellite imagery and analysis, you can potentially prove over the last 2 decades what sort of work has been done in certain places, right? And with that, that gives you the avenue to actually get real titles and real opportunities.
That's a great point. Why not work with local agribusinesses, especially farm input suppliers and traders? The example they gave was packaged loans with training and outcome indicators, because that could be an effective way to reach smallholder farmers.
Absolutely, that's been done already, and I think we can scale that and be a lot more intentional about doing it in a more deliberate way. So yes.
Are there any carbon models for regenerative agriculture except carbon that can generate enough credit to make it viable for smallholders?
So funny that somebody's asking it. So like one of the startups in our portfolio is called Bumitra. So they won the Earthshot Prize by, Prince William, Michael Bloomberg, and so on, like last year. So that's exactly what they're doing. So they use like satellite imagery, AI, soil samples, and they're actually more of a fintech startup than a regen ag startup. But like, so essentially they have the smaller farmers participate in the carbon credits. That's also why we've been actually testing them in Kenya. So to see actually, does this work? Can this scale? And carbon credits, we can have a whole session on that. But the question is, I think for me, what's interesting is like if the people that are actually like having the land, the soil, the farming, that they can benefit of it. Yes.
So quickly on that one, Bumitra, I think, works with remote soil carbon measurement, right? And that's their MRV way to do it. And I think what I see in general is it's all centric around making the carbon case per se, and how do we go into projects that are set up and where we can add on the carbon component, right? But what I don't see happen enough is how can we work with the majority of places which are not ready to be converted into carbon project, and then once you work with them, where is the capital actually to work with each individual farmer? So not to set up the carbon model itself, but actually do the investments to buying the inputs, to buying, what a smallholder farmer needs to actually make the transition, right? Because in all the carbon settings, that money doesn't come in most cases. There are some rare example. We have one group, Mafisa, right now that gets 95% of their funding through a carbon deal, a very long-term carbon deal, where the buyer, the off-taker, is also willing to take the risk, right? And saying if it doesn't happen, and they put up upfront money right now so that they can do the work right now, and they take the risk as well. And that, I think that's fantastic, right? We need more of those situations.
If you source products from small farmers, let's say coffee, how do you manage a situation when crops are impacted, like due to pests or weather? Just don't have coffee that year, right?
Yeah, it affects there's limited supply. You start looking everywhere which farmers can supply, which farms weren't impacted. Obviously, there's now less supply, so prices go up, and then you're thinking, how do I pass that on to customers in the processed product or whatnot? So that is why we're having this conversation today, right? We need to diversify farmers' incomes. We need to have them farming different types of crops and not sticking to just one. We need to just focus on climate adaptation, and regenerative agricultural practices are at the center of solving that issue.
So let's just talk a little bit about, in terms of this being the opening panel of this track, what are you looking forward to for the track for the next few days? Like, what should people go and check out, and what are you hoping some questions get answered?
you know, we three of us were very thoughtful about how we designed this and what we wanted to see during SOCAP, and the folks that we got to be on. I'm thankful to them for accepting the invitation to be on these panels. But I'm excited about the conversation around technology and the application of that. So your session, Bernard and Alex, hopefully we get some interesting ideas from that. I'm excited about the indigenous. I think that was one of the ones that you brought on, Heiner, the indigenous, the Amazonian conversation. So I really want to
on Wednesday.
So hopefully
I'm really excited to hear about how the connection soil health and climate, and can we find a way to do this? And James is going, who sees here, is going to moderate that session. That's Wednesday on 9 o'clock. So I'm really excited about that. Roy is having a session tomorrow at 9 about more concrete examples that do it right now, that are actually investable companies that do a combination of grant money and debt, and some of them equity as well. And so this is exciting too, because you see some real examples that are investable today. So these are just a few of the highlights.
And maybe just to add, like, so I think from everything you said, like, what could be breakthroughs by working together, right? And I think this happens in session, outside of session, like conversation that you might be having among each other with others also. Like, I think this is what I find exciting, where, you know, in the world that we live, in the impact we want to see, how might we get there, right? And like, if we can get to find some crazy ideas and we actually get a couple of people together to do that, why not?
So I think some people had some ideas, so let me share some. Is there an opportunity for community-owned co-ops to play the role of an aggregator?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
They already do it, but that's not enough. Usually the co-ops themselves, that's not the end. They are not able to directly access and fill out the forms and, you know, get access to carbon markets, for example, right? So there is often someone else that needs to work with the co-ops, right, to actually do the bridge and get it right now. Ultimately, hopefully, yes.
Do you have any concrete examples of institutional investors like pension funds who invested in Regen?
I would hope this exists, but I'm also not sure. Like, I mean, like, maybe Regen in the US, I don't know. It's like possible. Maybe somebody has an idea.
Someone maybe in the audience, anyone?
Exactly. How do you help farmers protect their income if their production is down? Which we kind of addressed a little bit earlier. Does anybody want to add to it?
Crop insurance, reinsurance, diversification of their crops. Yeah.
So a quick comment on the insurance. I'm oscillating between, you know, all the pros and cons, but what we need to be aware is on the insurance side is, let's not create a system where unsustainable practices can be continued and you get basically, you know, the money back if it doesn't work out. The real insurance is to do regenerative work, to do diversification, to put organic matter back into the soil, to do intercropping. That's going to be long-term the real insurance that we need.
Maybe just to say, like, I think it depends again, like, who are you looking at? Who is the farmer you're talking about, right? Like smaller farmers, like you're talking about, like, using any agricultural inputs, using, like, you know, diversifying, post-harvest loss handling, like things, very, very basic agricultural practices. Then you'll have the, you know, either diversification of crops, crop rotation, like very basic things that you could do to, like, and I think where technology or insurance model can help you is like where things that are also specifically outside of your control, like drought, right? So like, you know, like no matter how regenerative you are, like if a drought hits, you know, like you might be bankrupt, right? And I think now, again, this has limitations. If you have a sixth consecutive like crop failure because of drought, the insurance companies may no longer be willing to do that. But like, I think to where it is just an extreme weather event, I think there's definitely opportunities to insure against.
Equity. So in smallholder farming communities, women represent the majority of the labor, but hold a minority of the wealth. So as we reimagine the food systems, how do we restructure capital and policy to create a more equitable system? Very easy, low ball question there.
get more women in control of the capital and deploying money to more women-owned businesses and funds and farms. Yes, I'm pro that. That's what I do. Yeah, absolutely.
It's a tough one. I mean, like this is a question for millennia, including like shouldn't you value food more that has been grown, and like I think so. The problem is also like what's the share of the value that actually like the farmer gets versus like the supply chain, the traders, like the retailers, and so on. Now everybody, there's consumer choice, but then again, like this is what like how again. It's challenging. Even farm to fork digital kind of like food purchase, like that's hard. And how do you get it scale? Like, and there's a reason why retailers have a value, why traders have a value in the value chain. Stuff.
Yeah. My sense is also their technology can help. So I think a lot of the systems are set up which have more of a male, especially in the ag arena. It's a male-dominated world. If you look at the extension workers, you know, this is a business and a trade where people go door to door in multiple villages, and that's not something that in some places is something that women can do. If you have offerings and services that you can offer through phones and mobiles, etc., you can immediately access, you know, whole segments that otherwise are really, you know, harder to access. And I think be more deliberate about creating solutions and structures that are more inviting and more feasible, you know, for female farmers will make a difference.
The gentleman in the front has an example of the pension funds, but he did say it was cautionary. So it may not be a good story.
Okay. 1-2 Fund has money from German pension funds for agroforestry, regenerative cacao.
Great. Sorry, I just saw the note card come from there, so that's why I said that.
Hi, we're in Hawaii, and I think one of the issues with pension funds and investment is that they can perpetuate sort of large-scale extractive plantation economies if the investment is coming from outside of the community or place. And so I think a cautionary tale is that those investments should first center the place and the indigenous systems. And there's a lot of potential for regenerative investment, but I think if there's no connection, we're having a lot of issues with that, with someone that owns 40,000 acres and is now kind of, we're having water issues on Maui. So just, I think it's maybe a both and, but with some caveats.
That's interesting.
I mean, this is the same example, like as you're saying, like if you're a venture capitalist and like your main business is like you invest into stuff that creates maybe not regenerative ag and maybe not a better planet, and then on the side as a hobby you do that, like why can't you take this into your main job and take some of the other capital to also do good, right? Like, so I think like to what you're saying, like how do you broaden the pie that's available essentially?
Rockefeller Foundation and Future for Food just published a report, and I know that Heiner wanted to just speak a little bit about some of the takeaways, so I thought maybe you could talk about that.
I would just recommend that you have a look at that, and so it's in investing in regenerative financing for regenerative, you know, agriculture. And I think some of the findings are really super interesting. You know, for me, it was realizing we need 10 times more money right now. So it's about 43 billion or 44 billion going into regen right now. We need 430 billion, you know, per year. That's one interesting insight. The other one is, but now put this in perspective. So governments are currently paying out $600 billion in subsidies, right, for inputs, and these are often inorganic, you know, subsidies. And one of the really big levers we have is to redirect those subsidies into more sustainable organic, you know, varieties. And so looking at these amounts of money, 400 sounds like a huge amount, but think about the 600 billion that are going in there already. Another really interesting insight is that if you say who is already paying for this right now, the majority of the money is currently paid by farmers, right, and not by the governments and not by private investors. I think everyone has a role, right? Everyone has a the role. It's not one group has to pay it all, but we have to realize that it's not the fact that currently all the money is coming from private and governments. Is actually the farmers themselves are currently paying more for regen than the other two.
Oh, that's surprising. So I think we're almost at the close. If each of you had a closing remark to send people on their way.
Nothing. I think we've said it all. It's just enjoy the sessions. Please do try to follow this track. Really interesting insights. Let's focus on solutions and let's really connect and do more together. Thanks.
Yeah, +1. Like really try. Like let's find. Maybe we'll find one breakthrough or maybe 10 breakthroughs that we'll find here through SOCAP 2024. I'm counting on all of you. So easy ask, right?
Yeah, I look forward to continue the discussion offline and right after this panel and over the next few days.